Welcome to Zooming In Coronavirus Special. I'm Simone Gao. In this program, we're trying to bring you the most updated information about the coronavirus pandemic, and we also discuss some of the most important events regarding this topic for the day. Today, I have Maxey with me. He's the co-host of War Room Pandemic with Steve Bannon, and he's probably one of the most diligent observers of the coronavirus pandemic in the country. Jack, how are you today?
I'm doing very well, Simone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Why don't you give us an update of the current situation regarding the coronavirus today?
Well, I think it's clear that this is a global problem at this point. Nobody can claim that they're going to be able to hide from this. Some areas that I think are really of intense importance that we keep an eye on are going to be Africa. You've seen almost all of the countries in the perimeter of Africa now have it. Ironically, these are most of the countries with Belt and Road projects. So we're going to see, I believe, there a kind of explosion like we saw in the Middle East. I asked people to observe those countries a few weeks ago, and it sort of has come true. Also, I think that there's a clearer understanding amongst the global community that this is not going to be something that any country is going to be able to avoid. And I think that is settling into people's mindsets, and you're seeing it in the global markets. You're seeing it in the behavior that is occurring in various countries, closing their borders, closing schools, taking drastic action that I think 2 weeks ago would have been unthinkable for many of these places.
Yeah, I think there is one exception though, UK. Among all the countries in the world, I think the UK adopted a very different strategy. The government would no longer try to track and trace the contact of every suspected case, and it would test only people who are admitted to the hospitals, and they are not enforcing social distancing. And I think the rationale is that they worry about behavioral fatigue. If restrictions came into force too early, people would become increasingly uncooperative and less vigilant.
Well, it's interesting
you
you said that. There was yesterday a petition signed by a number of scientists questioning this action, and then there was also another letter signed by behavioral scientists who said, look, if you're going to use this as a justification, at least provide us with scientific data that proves that people will get behavioral fatigue. I think the thing that you have to understand where Great Britain is concerned is that they are trying to define which path to take, right? There is an inevitability about this virus to a certain extent, and the idea that it will infect the global population. Now, we speak of things like social separation, social distancing, flattening this curve of infection, and these are all very important things. But England, I think, is trying to create some sort of compromise that keeps the vital services and economy of the country operating while acknowledging that this is going to blow through their population. I will say one thing I will give Boris Johnson a lot of credit for is whether they are taking the wrong path or the right path. I think that the Prime Minister has been very, very clear that this virus will affect every family in Great Britain, and that their elderly are by far the most vulnerable. So they are taking a path of, I believe, trying to isolate their elderly as much as possible while trying not to collapse the country. And interestingly, when they announced that they were not going to close the schools, the members of the National Health Service, the doctors and nurses organizations, wrote a letter of thanks to the Prime Minister because they said, if you close all the schools, we're going to lose 25% of our employees. Now, perhaps these are not first-tier doctors, but you need orderlies and everyone else to keep a hospital functioning.
Mm-hmm. I think this is pretty worrisome. I mean, has the U.S. put travel bans against the U.K. yet?
Yes, the United States has put travel bans against the U.K. And look, there's been plenty of criticism about the way that the UK is handling this thing, and a lot internally as well. And to give you an idea, Scotland is not taking the track, it does not seem today, as the rest of England. And also Northern Ireland has essentially implied that they are going to follow a plan for the island of Ireland rather than some plan coming out of Whitehall or 10 Downing Street. So there's a lot of question as to what is happening, but I think that what everyone also has to understand, we can criticize one country's path versus another, but one thing that's becoming very clear is that social distancing, social separation, these can slow down the rate of infection. But I personally, from what I've read and what I'm observing as this goes around the world, it is uncertain whether or not you are actually going to stop the spread. Now, there are cases. Taiwan, we spoke about it last week, has done a magnificent job. So have some other countries. But this is going to affect each place a little bit differently, and each place and each country and each national system has to adapt to their own customs and their own way of life. So while we're all in this together, I do think we have to give nation states and various geographic locations a little bit of an opportunity to do what they think is best, just like you're going to see inside this country. Some places have declared states of emergency. Governor Cuomo is requesting the National Guard, and other places are taking a more measured approach. So this is a dynamic situation. I don't think that anybody really understands how this is all going to play out. Even the World Health Organization has said in their criticism of Great Britain that because we don't know how this is going to play out, they think that Great Britain is taking a very dangerous path. This was also said by the ministers in Singapore today when they added Great Britain to their no-fly zone. So there is by no means a consensus on whether or not they're doing a good job or whether or not they're doing a bad job. So it's something that we need to think about.
Okay, I think at least social distancing is trying to, just slow down the peak of when, just patients can overwhelm the hospitals, right? That's kind of the consensus. If they're not doing this, the hospitals are going to be overwhelmed very quickly, and their healthcare system is going to collapse, right?
Well, I don't know that I would say that their healthcare system is going to collapse. I think that probably they're going to be forced to make some hard choices, just like the choices that are being made in Italy, and particularly Spain right now is having a very difficult time keeping up with the new cases, and we could criticize Spain for having not gone into lockdown earlier. But I think that you can also see some bright spots out there. For example, South Korea has done a very good job of using, it's now publicly known, of using hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine alone, which is a traditional anti-malarial, antiviral, also has some other purposes for use in terms of treating people with rheumatoid arthritis. And if you look at South Korea, I believe their death count at this point is under 80. Or maybe 81 at this point, but yet they have the second largest number of infections in the world. So I think that as the medical field and medical professionals get their arms more around this, we are going to see the mortality rates drop, but at the same time, as resources get swallowed up by each nation, they are going to have to make decisions about which people they're going to devote those limited resources to. And I've said it many times, and I will say it every day. People need to prepare themselves emotionally for what is coming. There is a wave on the horizon, and those who cannot swim will drown. It's just a matter of mathematics at this point. And obviously, there is great concern about slowing down the rate of infection, slowing down the rate of people who need ICU care, because this will help keep our hospital systems functioning. But it is not going to be an equal outcome for each city, even in America. Some cities may take it on the chin, and some may remain largely unscathed. So this is going to be a crisis, I think, for people to get their arms around logically, but particularly emotionally.
There are two fronts in this pandemic. One is the virus itself, and another is the economy. So let's talk about the market a little bit. the stock market dropped more than 6% on Monday morning today. And this is after the historic press conference by President Trump on Friday that drove the market up to 10%. And just the day before that, on Thursday, on Wednesday night, actually, his televised speech was to blame for the plunge of the stock market for 9%. So my question is, that doesn't seem to have a big impact. So are we seeing this up and down becoming a new norm, or are we seeing a bear market inevitably?
I think that we are seeing average people, pension plan operators, investors, hedge fund managers, you name it, who are beginning to understand that there is tremendous uncertainty out there and that the news will probably get worse each day. I think the kind of optimistic tone that was tried to be put into this last week in terms of stimulus, in terms of a rate cut, in terms of a historic rate cut announced on a Sunday in hopes of changing the Dow futures, I think that the reality is this is not a crisis that is going to be solved by liquidity. This is a crisis that cannot be, every business cannot be saved by the federal government. Every family cannot be saved by some National Guard soldier running in with a ventilator. This is not going to happen. The National Pandemic Plan is very clear. Each individual hospital, local community, and state is responsible for what goes on inside their own borders. And I think it's very important that the president get out in front of this. You see Cuomo and he are having a Twitter fight today about Governor Cuomo has to do more, and Governor Cuomo saying, I have to do more, the feds have to do more. The American people need to know that between $8 and $12 billion was distributed amongst the states and municipalities to prepare exactly for what we are confronting today. Not a single state or municipality has completed the 5 steps necessary to achieve the aims of the National Pandemic Plan. Now, there's plenty of blame to go around, but nobody can claim that the plan is not already written in stone. I mean, everybody has known this for a long time. And I understand the governor trying to come out and make these requests, and I understand the president's desire to perhaps see them. But as this flows around the country, really it is the local and state governments that have to dust off their plans and define who has responsibility. And it's not the Army Corps of Engineers who are going to come up and build tilt wall hospitals like in Wuhan. For years, they should have been identifying high schools, elementary schools, etc. These are the obvious choices for creating isolation wards because of the way the classrooms are structured.
Right.
And they should have been doing this long ago.
Before we go into China, I actually have questions regarding China. But before we go there, I have another question. I mean, do you think the U.S. will go into an economic recession?
I think that the U.S. is already in recession. I think that we are going into recession, and I think that we are going into global recession. And I think this talk about saving it with an extra trillion or an extra 500 billion is really a bad decision on my part. This is Jack Maxey speaking only for himself. I was a former trader on Wall Street, so I do know somewhat of what I talk about. But I think the most important thing is that everybody has to understand that, you know, we're all going to suffer in this together. And this is one of those situations where government could not possibly plan to such a degree to make it so that nobody suffers. It's going to be universal.
Talking about government action, there are a few pieces of news coming out of China today. And according to the Chinese media, a Chinese family recently returned to China from the U.S. And the woman who was, she is a permanent resident of the U.S. And she was confirmed with a COVID-19 infection in Beijing. And the woman now is sued in Beijing for impeding the containment of infectious disease in China. So she is sued for this crime. What do you make of this?
Well, you're seeing this in the Chinese media to a large extent, this attempt to try and turn any new spread of this disease onto something from Italy or something from an Egyptian cruise or something like that. But there is the potential for reinfection in China. Even in Hong Kong, the director of their health system there said he did not think that Hong Kong citizens should travel for a year. And he said, while as a few weeks ago the world was afraid of us, we are now afraid of you. So although I have in no way any respect for the Chinese government, I can see how they're afraid that infection may be entering their country from other places. But let's get real. China is not under control of this virus inside China. And the people of China were betrayed by their own government, particularly the people of Wuhan. And we want to tell you, people of Wuhan, how much we respect you, how much we admire you, and the people of China. But they were the first victims. And the second victims were the people of the world. The Chairman Xi has a responsibility first to his own people, and then he has a responsibility as a member of the world nations to take care of the health of the planet. And their delay in reporting and their sort of attempt to make it seem not as bad as it was, I think left many of the national healthcare systems around the world a little too optimistic in my book.
And China now is, they're sending 1,000 doctors and a bunch of ventilators to Italy to try to help the Italian situation. And, after the Chinese diplomat Zhao Lijian, I think his name is Zhao Lijian, accused the U.S. brought the coronavirus to China, the U.S. hasn't had a formal response. What do you think the Chinese is trying to do, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do, and why hasn't the U.S. responded?
Well, I think that the U.S. has not responded necessarily overly aggressively because the president is still hoping that Chairman Xi will come through on the grain purchases. I have less certainty that is going to happen day by day. I think that the Chinese government is doing what communist governments have always.
You mean the 2,500
$250 billion worth
Right.
of purchases, and a large portion of that, I think about $55 billion, is going to be grains, soybeans, etc. But so I think the president is being very pragmatic in that regard. And yesterday in his press conference, he said something to the effect that while other people in the government may be saying this is not what Chairman Xi is saying to me. But going back to Italy and the promise of sending doctors and extra ventilators and all this stuff, what is so obscene about this was, and I'm hearing this from our Italian colleagues, originally it was going to be a kind of gesture of goodwill. But now apparently, just like Belt and Road, they have a price tag attached to it. If it were me and I wanted to send a message to Chairman Xi and the Chinese people, I would say do the right thing, but don't do it with any strings attached. And I think that they're playing a very dangerous game because the whole globe now knows that they have to rebuild their own pharmaceutical industries. They have to rebuild a chemical industry so that they can create APIs. And they have to take charge of the production of their personal protection equipment and everything else. So once we do all that, why would I still be making my iPhones there? Why would I still be making T-shirts for the Gap? I think China runs a very great and real and probably rational risk to have the entire world turn their backs on them as a trading partner, period. And I think that's something they should consider. They may make lots of things, but they don't make food.
Do you think the Chinese Communist Party is eager to put the blame on someone else at this moment?
I think the Communist Party is eager to always put the blame on someone else. And I think that we're hearing stories from inside China of people saying that their parents are now believing the propaganda that is being told. And this is fine, but here's something that can't be hidden. The truth eventually will out. And I don't think that this pandemic is over in China. If they force all of their workers back to work too early, they run the risk of having spikes in Shanghai and some other first-tier cities. So I think that all of us should take a pause and realize that this is not going to be over anytime soon, that this is a metaphysical crisis that the world has to confront with open eyes. And I think, as I've said many times, people need to prepare themselves emotionally for what they're going to watch occur across the planet, because it's not normal. It's not going to be something that anybody who is alive today has seen before, in my opinion.
Okay. I just want to make a comment on, the impact of WHO on average people's opinion on China. This WHO expert team went to China and came back with 100% positive review of China's handling of the epidemic. And the team lead even said, if I had a coronavirus, I would like to be treated in China. And that had an impact. This family from the US, this Chinese family went back to China. She had symptoms developed in the US, and I don't know what made her to believe that she should go back to China. Maybe she heard from the WHO team leader that if you had the coronavirus, you'd be better treated in China. And I heard people from, yeah.
Irony of ironies, this simple woman may have listened to the World Health Organization and headed back to China. But everything we were hearing in January and February was that the top leaders of the CCP were sending all their families to the U.S. and Vancouver and Sydney and everywhere but China. So this, again, is more propaganda, more nonsense, and frankly, we can now prove without a shadow of a doubt, I'll be happy to state it, that China has lied about their numbers, because we see what is happening in other countries. And does anybody really think that Wuhan's medical care was better than the care in Milan and northern Italy? I don't buy it for a moment. So we know that they were lying all along, and they've done this before. We know this. This is almost exactly what happened with novel coronavirus-1. That was the SARS virus of 2003. It started in November, and the world heard about it in late January, early February. This started in November, and the world heard about it in late January, early February. Now, the World Health Organization, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I think the United States should literally either take it over or stop funding it. You've got Tedros, the head of it. They just declared this a pandemic 4 or 5 days ago. Why? Because they're trying to protect the reputation of China. And Tedros is a member of the Maoist Party of Ethiopia. Let's be clear where his sympathies lie. They do not lie with the Western European liberal democracies. They lie with his patron in Beijing, Chairman.
Yeah, that's right. Last question. At the press conference on last Thursday, I think a AO1 reporter asked President Trump a question. And in part of his answer, President Trump said, we all know, they know where the virus came from. We all know where it came from. What is that? What do you make of that? What does
Well, I think that's Trump's soft-pedaled answer to her question, which was essentially, what do you think about the Chinese propaganda effort to try and make somebody else look like this virus started there? And there's a very interesting thing with the naming of viruses historically. They are named by the closest geographical thing. That is why, for example, Ebola is named Ebola. It is for a river in the Congo. And I don't see the president of the Congo out there complaining that his country has been associated with this virus, probably because he's a rational human being. On the other hand, you see Chairman Xi going out of his way to try and turn it into something other than what it is. You saw this also with the World Health Organization coming out with this silly name, COVID-19. That's not the official name. The official name is SARS, novel coronavirus-2. -1 was the original SARS virus of 2003.
Mm-hmm. So you do not think the president was implying something other than, the virus came from China. He did not imply the virus came from maybe
I think the president was trying to, in a delicate way, say everybody knows where this virus came. It came from China. There's no question. And if this were another era where the whole world wasn't afraid of making Chairman Xi cry, it would have been called the Yangtze fever or the Wuhan virus, just like Ebola was named Ebola for the river in Congo. So enough of this nonsense. This is a global pandemic. It can affect every human being, independent of their race or political party. But it is important that we not allow the Chinese to try and, after setting our houses on fire, throw a ladder up to the third story and help a few people climb out and claim that they're saving the day. It's just not true.
Thank you, Jack. That's it for today's coronavirus special. You are watching Zooming In with Simone Gao. Please also download our podcast and be sure to come back tomorrow.